So keep by 360 on or not? Do we want to know or do we not want to know? It's like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm usually the one that's.
But you're all right. Come on, this is your civic duty. This is how you learn how to participate. Why did you come over here? Because I'm gonna show you, this is what you do, right? You fill this out, and then you give it to me. And then you come over here, and then when we're ready for public comment, for agenda items, you come right over here and you speak.
We're gonna get started here, so we're calling to order 1.1, call to order of this session. I'd like to call to order the July 19th, 2023 Governing Board Trustee Special Meeting, Governance Workshop, Demographics and Enrollment Update at 6:01 p.m. 2.1, approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion approves. Motion to approve the agenda passes. And we are at 3.1, public input concerning items on the agenda. Is there any public input on concerning items?
No.
No speakers. Okay. No speaker slips, then we will move into 4.1, governance workshop, demographics enrollment updates.
Great. So this board workshop is to provide the board with information regarding demographics and enrollment, including new information the district has regarding our district's demographics and enrollment, and the implications for the district's budget and capacity. So we'll start off with Mr. Delpanty. We have several of us providing information to the board this evening. We have some information and then
President Locke, members of the board, and myself and Brian Stanley, Super HR, will be taking us through a presentation with some information to help illustrate the new information I have here, and then I will hand it off to Ryan to kick us off.
All right, great. Well, good evening. So I will go ahead and jump in. So tonight we'll be sharing with you information related to enrollment forecasting. And we'll do a brief revisit of what exactly goes into an enrollment forecast, looking at what is the process of, why within our district, how have we been using the forecast and what's the background. Looking at information that's related to forecasting is really critical for our purposes and our needs, looking at kindergarten birth rate data, and then also, which really helps to inform our incoming kindergarten class, and then also looking at that information to then look at what enrollment forecasts look like across the district through K through 6 for us. We'll also then be outlining after we go through the general process and information specific to Del Mar. We then will talk about the budget implications for our district. We'll talk about the implications for our facilities. And then as we'll share with you at the end, as we're looking at the trends and the information that we're receiving, we'll pose the question as we're looking at that new information, wondering if we're settling into a new normal right now. So first of all, as you know, we've been working with Davis Demographics for a number of years, and they recently actually merged or partnered and been bought out with a company called MGT. And so truly Davis Demographics within the industry, they are considered the gold standard of demographers. They have over 30 years of enrollment planning, and they pride themselves on the fact that that's actually all that they do. They only work with enrollment planning, looking at how to work on planning and then addressing additional ongoing demographic changes and trends within the school district. And they also only work with school districts. And so this is 100% their bread and butter and what they really like to do. So they provide districts with demographic reports, attendance and trustee boundary planning, and then GIS services. Those geographic information systems. So on I can look up that acronym to see exactly what that said. And then in addition, as they've now merged with MGT also then provides resources to schools with information regarding facilities, supporting business services, supporting HR, and then also technology supports. So when we really looked at what an enrollment forecast is, the purpose behind why we have an enrollment forecast is really to help identify the districts. What are the trends that we're seeing within the district? How might these trends affect either future student populations for what that's going to mean for how many students are going to be coming into our district, and then also identifying as we're seeing shifts or students moving into the district looking at enrollment, looking at how that might also impact facility planning for a school district. So Davis Demographics, they use a lot of geographic information. And so really what they are looking at is, they're looking at what's called centerline database. So they geocode students to individual streets. They design study areas that are almost like little specific neighborhoods within a boundary. They look at those little study areas as almost the little subsets, the little building blocks of a particular boundary within a particular school set. So they can drill down even within a neighborhood or a certain cluster of homes and look at data coming out. They use student historical data. So for example, and we'll talk specifically about what that looks like in Del Mar. We look at student cohort data to analyze typically when kiddos come to our district, do they tend to stay with us or do you start to see mobility change? We look at current data, and so in a little while we'll be sharing information such as birth rates. What are we seeing with trends with birth rates? Because we know that those birth rates for students who are born within our boundary, within our footprint, then can represent our potential students 5 years later as we're looking to project out how many students we anticipate coming through. And then they also use information looking at planned residences, looking at building that's happening. So they'll go through and use matrix to identify, we know that we're planning, we have a single family development, how many students would we anticipate typically come out of a single family home? How many students typically come out of a multifamily attached home as well? How many students would we project that we might be receiving down the line from an apartment as well? And so really they use a lot of that geographic data to help inform our forecast. And then they also employ a 7-year methodology. Really, when we start projecting out to things, once you get too far out, those predictions become less and less reliable as information changes. And so really what they're saying is that they found that 7 years is really sufficient to meet the facility planning needs of a district. When you're looking about facilities, you're looking several years down the line, so saying that 7 years down the line seems to be sufficient. And also, once you get beyond 7 years, you're really delving more into speculation just because of the information is much more. That part makes sense. So, what's really critical for us when we start using the enrollment reports and when we start looking at the forecasts, a very critical piece of data that we look at are birth rates according to our zip code. They look at the zip codes that are within Del Mar Union School District's boundary. And in working along with the California State Department of Health, they'll go back and track, okay, about how many students were born within our footprint. Because again, once you identify how many students were born in a particular year, they will then use their matrix, their analysis that we'll show later, to then project out if about this many students were born this year, they'll be coming to our district in 5 years. And so that helps us project what those incoming kindergarten classes might look like for us. The other piece that they really look at are those cohort survival, I'm standing out of the term, but those cohort survival factors. And so what they then do is they then look at not only, the first bullet was trying to project how many students we anticipate will be coming to our district, but then we look longitudinally at what happens when students show up within our schools. Once they show up here in Del Mar, what we're able to find, and Chris will show on one of his slides, that actually we're very different than many other districts where students start in school and then you end up in a district and then you end up having high mobility, in which a lot of those students then leave and move out of the district. When we were talking with Davis Demographics, they actually said that we're one of the very few districts that they work with where actually, once our students start with us, they stay with us. And over time, we've seen that we end up throughout that whole cohort, that the number of students that would start in kindergarten, by the time that they leave, throughout the entire time, we see a trend having more, like 1 to 3% more students that start. So I really believe that that's because we are an outstanding school district. We have outstanding teachers. We have outstanding programs. It's a great place to live. So really, once people get settled in here, we know that they value what we do. They're not looking to move on, to trade up. We'll talk about there might be some of the financial reasons why they might not also move on to next steps, but it really is nice to see that our kids really tend to stay with us once they come in. And then the last part then that they'll look at are those student yield factors. So again, we are mostly built out, we know right now within Pacific Highlands Ranch. But whenever we do have new developments, like I said, that's when they'll also, as part of their calculations, that's where they'll go through and assign a variable, a number for how many students we would plan to typically receive out of a single family detached. So, for example, part of their analysis, they say traditionally, if you have a new home, a single family detached, on average, we can expect to receive about 0.56 student for every detached house. And you see a lower capture rate if it's multifamily detached. And then lastly, we see a 0.16 a student for every department. So those are the pieces that really make up the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of our enrollment report. It's helping us look at those kinder birth rates 5 years down the line, 5 years previously, to help us project out how many students we would anticipate receiving year after year. We look district-wide across patterns to see what does that cohort survival rate look like, to find out, are we seeing students as a whole moving into our district, moving out of our district, and then also looking at those student growth factors. So what I'm going to do now is that's kind of the big picture of what a demographic report looks like. I'm going to turn it over to Chris right now, and he's going to share some DMUSD numbers.
So, as Ryan said, birth rates are the biggest thing we use when we're talking about our kinder enrollment. And so, this is the birth rate information. I'll put it there, I can't see my screen. This is the birth rate data for our district. And so, if we look at this last year, we'll point out a couple of things. One, the births in our area for the 2017 are what equate to the numbers for our 2022-2023 school year, which we're calculating in 2022. So August of 2022, we're looking at 5-year-olds in that range, and that's the calculation that we'll use. So if your students born in 2018 then, those are the students that we would expect for the 2023 school year. And what you'll see is a couple of things to note. First, this is, that's the assumption we're making, that birth year leads to this school year. The other piece is that there are 2 ways that you then can calculate the number of students you get. One is looking at your base year and then determining what is the percent of birth rates going forward. So with 560, this year's birth rates would be 111.6% last year. So you can calculate based on that, saying how many students do we have in kindergarten in 22-23. 111.6% of that would give us 2023-24's year. Another way is a capture rate, and that's looking at how many of these births do we...
The percentage off of the total. So percent change is based upon the total column?
It's based on the base year. So the base year is 560, then 625 is 111% of that, yes. So you'll see that then 549 is in the number below it, so it's slightly under 100% of that. And it calculates it to years before as well. The other way to do it is a capture rate, and so these are the 2 basic ways that you do it. And the capture rate would be when we look at over a certain period of time, what is the percent of those births that we would capture as kindergartners. And so we have looked at this both ways, and we have over the last couple of years looked at a capture rate, and we'll explain why. And we've used the capture rate that is based on a longer period of time. So trying to get an average of what we are capturing for kindergartners, and we've used that to give us some balance between what was seen in the pandemic and what we've had before, in the expectation that this year would be a year that we'd be bringing back to normal. We're seeing a lot of the world come back to normal, and there has been an expectation in our district, and actually in about 90% of other districts, that you would see some bounce back by this year in the kindergarten capture rate and the kindergarten enrollment rate that we're coming to. The other item that Ryan talked about was a cohort survival rate, and so this is a little more detail on that. We are seeing over the last couple of years a 103% cohort survival rate. So that means that over the course of our students who they begin in kindergarten and then moving K-1, 1-2, etc., we are seeing a total of 3% increase over that period of time. You'll notice that the only real area where we have steady decrease, and we have seen this, if you look back over time, we typically see some decrease 5 to 6, And we attribute that to, we do have a number of students who will go on to a private school experience from middle school. Oftentimes that starts in 6th grade. So we have traditionally seen a little bit, that's the one area where we may not see the increase continuing, but overall, we see a lot more of it in the primary grades, and overall, we do see an increase in that cohort survival rate. So this means that we are seeing an increase in current students year over year. So each year we do have some offset for any students that maybe we lose in one manner through some of that cohort survival rate, although it is obviously the smaller number with that 3%. Then when we look at our projections for this year, our projections for this year are based on a 76% capture rate, and that 76% is the average of 2015 through 2022. So that gives us a broad time frame. It's looking at pre-pandemic, and it's looking at evening out, because what we've seen is we moved into those 2 main years of the pandemic, which were 2020, 2021, and then coming into 2022, we've seen a lower capture rate. However, we also know that there's been an impact to the pandemic. We know that people, there were definitely people who were more fearful to come back to school. We know that we've seen people who have moved on to private school in some situations in our district, and we know that there have been some changes that have just happened in the world. The expectation was that in 2023, this year, we would start to see that bounce back. This was our largest kinder birth rate year that we've seen in since 2018, so we've in 5 years, and we don't see a kinder birth rate year that is as high as the 625 that we have for this incoming year in the near future. And in our conversation with our consultant at Davis Demographics, their numbers they're seeing for 2022 and now in 2023 continue to be lower. So we don't expect to see a kinder birth year that would be as high. So this really seemed like the year that we would have a benchmark, kind of a high water mark, very likely, because we expected to have some bounce back. We expected to see us go back into a level of normalcy. We are seeing that across society. And what the reason we're here tonight is because we're not seeing that bounce back.
Just a clarification that, so capture rate, so that means 24% of kids are going to private school or something?
Not necessarily, so that's births that we have. So those births, you can have people who move out.
76% of births.
Exactly, so it's based on birth. Kindergarten is the one area where we don't have any real knowledge of them until they get to us. And so that's where we have to make some assumptions. So birth rate is the best assumption to build off of. But again, they could move out of the area, they could go to private school. There are a lot of ways that they may move on. So this year's enrollment numbers, I'm going to hand it back to Ryan to speak to where we are right now.
Yeah, and as Chris was saying, the trend that we are seeing, that differs from what we were seeing pre-COVID, is that we are now realizing a lower capture rate of those students who were born. And so what that, and as Chris was saying, the reason that we're here today is, as we were doing our planning, looking for this school year, we were looking at, we're beyond the pandemic, we are getting back to normal for all intents and purposes, and we were looking at this almost bumper crop of kids who were born 5 years ago. So we had the highest number of births, and so then as we were running our projections to anticipate how many students were we anticipating would be coming to our school, we're seeing that right now well below that 76% capture rate that we were projecting out. As of last Friday, we have 349 kindergarten students enrolled. Now, part of our job with planning and looking ahead is registration isn't over. And so we also know that registration continues to stay open between now and the first day of school. So one of the things that Chris and I did is we tried to go back and find out, okay, on average, when we look backwards, generally how many students in kindergarten tend to enroll between this time of year and the first day of school. And so what we have found is that during 21-22, in the 21 school year and the 22 school year, on average, between about now and the start of school, we gained, on average, an additional 37 students. And then if we look for a longer period of time, back from 27 to 2022, we found that we still continue to receive about, on average, 44 students. Now, as we were looking at the capture rate, as we were looking at how many students we were anticipating to receive, that's that bottom bullet there. We were anticipating, hearing from the demographers, looking at trends across the state, we were anticipating this was gonna be our bounce back year. And so as we were beginning our planning, as we were thinking about staffing, as we were thinking about just planning for this next school year, those assumptions that we were making based on the data was having us project for about 475 students. Whereas instead, when we look at, we're currently at 349 students enrolled now, and then this is truly our best estimate right now. If we look in at traditionally how many students might continue to come through, if we look at 349, an average of 37, we're looking at approximately a cohort of 390 students. When from our projections using that 76% capture rate, we were anticipating that number to be closer to 475.
What's
I
the
see.
implied capture rate then for this?
It's hard to say what it is right now.
So that's a 390, what would that be, I guess?
Yeah, we can tell you.
Yeah.
I got this guy next to me, so yeah, he can.
No, just interesting.
Yeah, and on the next slide that I'll put up too, that'll also help demonstrate this pattern.
62 and a half.
Dramatically lower than we've ever had, which is also surprising.
So are we the only district like ourselves that's experiencing this?
No, Vista just closed 2 schools.
Pardon?
Vista just closed 2 schools. Vista Unified, it's across the state. It's been declining for years, and it's going to continue to decline for at least 4 more years.
So I guess my question is, we went into the year, or when, before enrollment started, with an expectation of a number, and we're below that number. Are we having that episodic issue, like right now? I realize it may be a trend in another district, but like this year, is everyone also getting the same surprise? How many other districts we talked are getting the same surprise?
So everybody is, when we talk to Davis demographics, it's about 90% of the districts that they're working with were, calculating their projected enrollment similar to us. And that they are all now looking at adjusting calculations and looking at something that's lower because there was a fairly large assumption that we could see some bounce back this year. This is the year where we're getting back to normal, and it is not being realized across the board. 2/3 of districts in the state are in declining enrollment. The state of California is over 6 million students statewide as of last year for the first time since 2000. So there is a general decline in enrollment, but there also was a lot of uncertainty with the pandemic. And we had some unknown as to where did students go because there were quick declines. And so there was a feeling and an inability to know for sure, is this something that is going to correct itself, or is this something that is potentially a new normal? And I think that's where we needed to be able to assume that there's potentially more students, because it is harder to adjust up and plan for more students than to adjust down and plan for less students. And so what we're seeing though now is that we can't carry it forward likely with this kind of projection. So we'll show in another slide, a couple slides, another way that it's projected that gets us a little closer to normal, because we also need to start thinking about what does that mean for us in the long term. If we continue on some trend like this, where is our district as a whole, not just kindergarten, as a whole, where might our district enrollment be in 3-5 years? And we can look at that with not complete accuracy, but with another set of assumptions that gets us a little bit lower and gives us some idea of where we might be as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to see the sudden change in the capture rate, and anecdotally, just based on my own observations, my own kids, friends, it seems like there was a lot of people moving out of town, around the time of the pandemic. So that to me wouldn't suggest like a new normal, it would suggest a one-time event that's still making its way through the system. And so I'm sure you're gonna kind of continue going through the analysis, but to me, a sudden change in capture rate sounds like a one-time event and not a trend.
And what we're seeing though is we had a change for 21 that was down to 70%, almost 71, then to 70% for last year. And so 1 year, okay, 2 years maybe, but we're looking at a year that should be getting us back to normal. And now we're in the 3rd year where we're potentially even lower. I mean, if we're under 70%, we've never had a capture rate below 70%. So we're getting to a point where it's not just flattening, we're looking at potentially a continued decrease, which is,
Our enrollment's been declining since before COVID.
it's been declining, but it's how we are enrolling our kindergarten numbers, which really impacts the rate of decline.
And in terms of I'll call it the supplies or the big dip, what are the underlying causes that we in other districts and NTS, NTG, are believing behind the increased rate of decline?
So they've talked about, as Erica spoke to, there are people who, especially in the pandemic, left for a couple of reasons. Some left because you could work remotely, and so they chose a maybe cheaper place to live. They could work remotely, that could work. Some people, housing prices have pushed out. We're seeing, somewhat anecdotally, but knowing people who work in Texas or in other states where they are building schools, just popping them up because there is movement. And so we are seeing some movement, especially with school-age students out of the state. There has been some movements to private school and to homeschooling, but it doesn't account for all of the students that are being quote lost from not just our district, but the state of California. So there is a movement out that is part of it as well.
And that is exactly what people are asking. It's just as Chris is saying, the fact that we're seeing declining enrollment across the entire state, it's about where are these students? What is it that we're starting to see? So as Chris was talking about seeing that capture rate changing over time. So this next slide, what it shows then is, so if you look at the columns for 2019, 2020, what that shows is that those students who came to school in 2019 and 2020, that means 5 years ago, in 2014, there were 582 students that were born within our footprint. And so of that 582 students who were born, then based on our CBEDS data, from the data that we collect, it's reported the first Wednesday of the month in October, it's our state level data, we then realized we had 504 of those students who were then sitting in our classrooms. And so what that means is that for that particular year, that shows that we had an 86.6% capture rate from the student population. If you hop over to the next column, 2020, so a similar pattern, you'll see that back in 2015, the Davis demographics was recognizing that there were 580 students who were born, and then we were able to capture 450 of those who showed up to school 5 years later, which was a 77.4% rate. Then, as you'll start to see in 21, 22, we start to see, and again, right, we're moving into the pandemic, we're starting to see that capture rate, that's at 70.9 in the 21-22 school year. In 22-23, we see that capture rate is at 70%. Again, we are still coming out, when you think about when that school year started, we're still coming out of COVID and waiting to see what things are going to look like. As Chris said, everything that we saw was, okay, are those 70%, is that a new normal? It was a dip from what we had historically received from Davis, and I will also share that when we look back at Davis's projections prior to COVID, they were pretty right on. They fluctuated from within 3% accurate to off by 7%. And so there were some years actually that they projected to be even came in above the projections as well. Whereas when we see the difference in percentage of capture rate, it's since the pandemic, we've seen that rapid, not that rapid, but we've seen that decline in capture rate. So we saw it for the 21-22 school year, for the 22-23 school year. And to your point, Eric, as we're sitting here today, trying to identify what we might be for 2023-24 school year, are we going to be at around that 70% capture rate? Might it be lower? And so those really are that's why we're talking with us today. And so not only do we then look at what happens once our students come into kindergarten, then as they move through our system, if we start to see those numbers, then that also shows an impact for enrollment across our district. So Chris will talk
So
about
this is
slide.
the other way that we talked about that it can be calculated is looking at the base year and saying what's the percent of birth rate. So if if we had 392 in 2022, and in that birth year we had 560 births, in 2023 we have 625, it's 111.6% of the births, then you could say 392 times 1.116, which would be 111.6%, that would give you about 438 kindergartners that we expect this year. This is building it off of the current, so it builds it off of the fact that we have had declines for those last 2 years that builds us down a little bit more. Based on what we're getting right now, it does seem like we probably won't get to 438 kindergartners this year, so this still could be somewhat high. But what this helps to illustrate is when the capture rate reduces, and if we continue to have some lower kindergarten classrooms, our total enrollment starts to dramatically change. And so when we get out 5 years, our total enrollment, based on these numbers, would be at 3,400 students. That's 1,000 less than we were at our top. And so that's, you know, if we were staying somewhat even, if we had that 76% capture rate, that kept us somewhere in a range where, you know, we're doing some small reduction, but we're staying fairly flat. When we see kindergarten numbers coming in like this, and we potentially are starting a new pattern for it, we are looking at a place where we may not flatten out until 4 or 5 years from now, and that flattening out could be considerably lower. Part of that is because if you look at our current, our biggest classes are in the upper grades, and then we're now starting to enroll classes in the low 400s, maybe below 400. Even with our cohort survival rate, it's not going to build us up to 500 student classes. So that's where we're getting into a range of, this is looking like it could be fairly dramatic over the period of time over the next 5 to 7 years. The other thing to note again is, as we're talking to Davis Demographics, again, they are seeing districts starting to make adjustments like this to how they're calculating. They're looking at it as they move into next year's projections. We wanted to get ahead of that and have the conversation because of what these numbers look like, and we felt like it was important to have the discussion. I think it also really, our numbers coming in at the number they are in kindergarten, it makes it a little bit harder to project right away. So we'll have to also be updating this and taking a look at it as we get real numbers and kind of move towards the next year.
Just a point of clarification on this chart, is that kindergarten line, what is the rate that you're using?
So the rate we're using is based on the, let me go back, I'll show you what the line is. So it's based on this. So it's based on our, the base year, and then how does that birth rate apply to the base year? So they take the base year of 392, and then they say, okay, well, with 625 births, we should have 111% of that. That's the 438. With 596 births the next year, we should have 106% of that. So if we look at
This chart is based upon
this
births
chart,
and doesn't reflect the rate of.
it is not a capture rate. It's purely based on birth rates as a comparison to the base year. And the reason then we get a little bit of a difference is because now we're comparing it to a low year that came in instead of just a general capture rate that we're seeing over the course of a 7 or 8 year period.
Looking at this second interim report from 2020 to 2021. Criterion standards, enrollment not met. Enrollment has not been overestimated by more than the standard for the prior fiscal year, 2 or more of the previous 3 fiscal years. And then there's that fall 2021 and 22 report from Davis Demographics where they say that enrollment's going to be increasing by 3% every year, but then they have further down in the report showing that it's decreasing. So I feel like we've known that it was declining for some years now, and just.
We have
It
seen.
has been declining.
Yeah, it has been declining. I think that the rate and the impact of the pandemic are two things that have been unknowns that every district in the state has been wrestling with over the last couple of years. Is how is this going to play forward? Are we going to come out of the pandemic and find that we are going to have some sort of bounce back in student numbers? And we are coming out the other side, and what we're seeing right now, this data does not show us having a bounce back, and so that's why we're bringing this
Can
to
you
you.
imagine a scenario or factors that this would increase somehow? I know that the forecast it appears to be continuing decline. Is there any other reasons that you might think that potentially this could go the other way?
The only real way would be if we have a stream of students moving in some manner, because if you think about it, our birth rate data, we aren't seeing more births, and in fact, based on our preliminary conversations, the next year or two at least are going to see continued lower births. So unless people enroll at a higher rate, or we have some move-in, there's really no other way to, you know,
And the houses are built out pretty much so.
I think that's another piece, yeah. So Pacific Highlands Ranch is pretty much built out. When we look at the numbers of potential development, it's pretty small. So there are some pieces and pockets where we might get 50 students this year, or 60, but those are built into these forecasts as well. And so they've looked at it, and they look at housing starts, and they have an idea of the potential projects that we have in our area.
So barring some sort of kind of drastic migration to Carmel Valley and Delmar, it looks like it's going to continue to decline.
It looks like it will decline and flatten out over the next, based on these numbers, 5 years or so. And if you look at, just looking at this year's numbers, I mean, that, say, 2nd or 3rd grade through 6th grade, those numbers are noticeably bigger than K1. And then this year, if we have another little kindergarten, you're gonna have, you know, a kindergarten in the high 3s, 400, and 1st grade that's around 400, at 2nd grade that's around 475, and these are multiple grade levels under 500. And I think that's the thing that we start seeing, is if we have multiple grade levels under 500, 500 times 7 grades is 3,500. That's what makes sense that we would end up being under 3,500 students over a period of time. So that led us to, there are some budget implications. There's some new information that we wanted to bring to the board and discuss, and then there's some implications just generally related to how we budget. When we look at some new information with our state budget, we have some good information. The adopted state budget includes the reductions that were in the block grants that we shared with the board at our budget adoption have mostly been reversed. So this is all one-time money, but we look to be getting just over $1 million back in the arts, music, and instructional materials discretionary block grant, which has fairly broad discretion for use, and it's something that we actually were going to use for textbook adoption. So it's something that will alleviate some general fund strain by having that money back. The learning recovery emergency block grants, we recouped approximately $280,000, so almost $1.3 million in one-time funds that are coming back to the district. There is intent language for the rest of the learning recovery emergency block grant money to come back, but intent language, depending on, it doesn't seal it, and it doesn't mean that we necessarily will, but there's potential for some more to come back over 25, 26, around that. So in the, when the bill is signed, they can put in intent language that says the intent is to do this. It doesn't, by law, mean that we will get that, but it means that the intent of the legislature was for that to be given back to districts, and I believe starting in 25, 26. That will all be dependent upon the economy at that point, though, and the state budget.
And is that learning recovery emergency block grant have any kind of intended uses, or is it?
Yes. Well, we had intended uses, so we'd already come up together with a plan that we shared with the board. This would allow us to keep some of those plans. Much of that was around things like some of our TOSAs and supports that we're doing intervention for students.
So for just to clarify, the $1 million probably be ongoing benefit.
It's one time, both of those are one-time.
Oh, that's one time.
Yeah, so this is all one-time money, restricted funds that are in block grants. So again, not ongoing, but good to know, because it does take some money out that we may have spent from general fund for things like a textbook adoption for the arts and music, for example. Prop 28 is ongoing funding. It's over $900,000. We do have 3 years to spend each 3 years allocation, and there we have been. It's been suggested by both SF squared and school services that caution should be taken in planning for this. It is not clear and there has not been direction given on how to calculate what is the supplement versus supplant. Things like foundation monies, does that count as something that we would count in the supplement or the supplant? Things like, so the language for Prop 28 is that you must supplement the program, not supplant something you're already doing. So you can't pay for something you're already doing. However, there are conversations and questions about if we have declining enrollment and we keep arts at the same level, we are actually spending more per pupil. And so would that be a supplement because we are now spending more money per pupil even though we have the same number of STEAM teachers, for example? Or if you have outside donation money, which isn't revenue from the state, is that something that is counted in that? So there's just, even the audit guide isn't supposed to be out in March. There's a lot of information that isn't there, and we want to make sure that we're doing this right. We're going to pass audit, we're going to use it in an appropriate manner. So that money is there, but has not been allocated yet because we want to make sure that we're doing it the right way.
So it's not clear, it's not
And it's
clear
not,
as to what
it's
we're
not,
paying for.
yeah, not clear, and so we haven't budgeted for it yet. So we will have that revenue, so that's money that will be used, but we are waiting to make sure that we do it the right way and are using it appropriately. And that's ongoing money, so that's money that will be coming into our budget, and we'll be updating the board to get more information on how that can be used.
So on a related topic on revenue, realizing a year ago we wouldn't expect the surprise we're discussing today on enrollment, and it's hard to have a crystal ball on the revenue side, but given the economic changes over the last 6 months or so with housing prices either stabilizing, going up or down, or interest rates and mortgages, have you received any inputs on whether we think our revenue projections are still pretty predictable, that's already built into our plan?
We don't have any, we haven't received information that would make us question our revenue assumptions from just a couple months ago when we built the budget to now. So I think that our revenue projections are solid right now. This does, it's a great segue to budget implications though. The one thing that it does bring to mind is we budget for a flat enrollment and really for a flat teaching number of sections over in this budget. So 23-24, we budgeted for 177 teachers. We carry the same number to 24-25, the same number to 25-26. So we have the same number of sections budgeted for that we had in last school year. If we do start to see a reduction in enrollment and we're budgeting for the same number of teaching staff, then we have budgeted for more teaching staff than we would need over the multi-year projection that we provided the board. If there is a reduction in enrollment, if these numbers stay true, we will have budgeted for more teachers than necessary over the course of the 3 years of the multi-year. And then that will mean, as we potentially have reductions in number of sections, that we would have budgeted for more STEAM plus staff than potentially necessary. So there is obviously something we'll be monitoring. Ryan's working on getting the final numbers with staffing for this year. We do not have any situation where this year any staff, we would lose any staff, and Ryan can speak to that. But
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm also aware that we do have a couple teachers in the room too, and so just that, as we built our projections out, since we built out our projections of looking at enrollment in sections, we have over the summer had some resignations, we've had retirements, and so as a result of that, all of our teachers that were offered contracts, our permanent staff, our tech teachers that we brought back and offered contracts, we will still have enough classroom sections for them for next year. So this is not impacting our teaching staff next year.
Just to clarify, like, there has been some reduction in the amount of teachers as it is just kind of natural attrition. And so it would largely remain the same, I suppose, in terms of like, if you reduce, there's a couple of class sizes, or smaller class, or fewer classes, and it probably would look roughly about the same for the students and also the teachers as previous.
For teachers, yes, the questions that we'll need to look at, so for example, we're looking where that enrollment is coming in, so it's making us identify, okay, we plan for X many sections at this particular school, at this particular grade level, does that still hold true, or do we need to look at, we've got more students trying to enroll in a particular school, do we maybe need to add an in-person section? We're also then looking at, if we're not seeing enrollment coming in at a particular school site would have any questions too about, hey, we said that we were gonna have, I'm gonna make up a week number, but if we said we were gonna have 6 kindergarten sections there, and then it turns out, oh, we only have room for 5, we only need 5 for next year. Due to some of the other unanticipated changes, over summer, we've had a couple staff members that we've lost. Those teachers would then be able to reassign and have them move into some of the other sections.
And another way to look at it would be to say, could you show us the, keep the teachers stable, and you have this new adjusted class size enrollment, what is the change in class size? So we're talking about 1 less student per class, we're talking about real, just to get an order of magnitude, just keep that teacher steady and use the enrollment projections that you have in the 390 or whatever you have. And let's just see how much is it really moving the needle on class sizes if we don't try to reduce sections.
Yeah, I guess, the question is kind of, if they really remain the same, like what would it kind of look like for students and for determining class size? It sounds like that's kind of getting as if some teachers have less, or kind of roughly, in terms of the need for a teacher integration, it sounds like it's roughly about the same, but anything like specific, like what would it look like?
So the other implication that we looked at was facilities, and to be totally honest, we have open rooms at schools every year, and we have good programs that we put into them, and so I tried not to count things like a reader program that has been in the school for a while, or I do for an after-school program. Our principals are coming back, so this is a first rough look at this, because we want to include them. But looking at that, we have about 19 open rooms across the district. We didn't include, obviously, Del Mar Heights. Carmel Del Mar is full. Sage Canyon, we're still working through some things and making sure that we have everything space-wise with them so that we put zeros there. But looking across the district, we also do have 4 classrooms for sure this year that we have kindergartens that would have rooms with restrooms that would be not used at this point looking into next school year.
You have those 19 rooms, like, do you typically have them open? What do you kind of?
Well, at some sites you have, for example, maybe some decrease in enrollment. So some sites you'll have, a big 6th grade class that leaves, so you have a couple of sections that it wasn't an open classroom last year, it is an open classroom this year. And then there are a number of things that might happen. There might be some intervention. It might be that there is another program that uses that. If we have a combo, there's often some use of an extra classroom. So it varies by school site. We sometimes give some extra space for intervention. Has been a big one the last couple of years because through that learning recovery block grant, we have been able to have extra intervention. So pieces like that, we have to use those extra spaces for. And then, when you have space, schools find a way to use it, kind of like gas. It just kind of spreads into the space. But we definitely do have some space open, and at a couple of schools, we will have a multi-area classroom.
I just recall that when I'm visiting on the sites, there's usually, I know that there'll be some big space here, but it somehow is always filled.
Yeah.
It's always being used for something. Like, say Shannon, for instance, definitely it was they all used up this year.
Yeah.
But even like the other schools that into the air, whatever, no B or no then it gets filled up with something.
Definitely. And and that's why we would like to work with the principals. So if there is something, if there's a need at a site, we always have a conversation with the principal looking at, here's the need, what can we do to satisfy the need? And we have had that at different times for different programs that we need to make sure that we have a home for.
Are you able to forecast well into the future about the availability of rooms, specifically the kindergarten rooms with bathrooms? Are you able to do that?
We could do some projection. For this meeting and looking at where we really looked at where are we this year, but we could take a look at what would the impact be, if we had the numbers that are on some of our projections for next year for kindergarten. As we look out, Del Mar Heights will obviously open. That will add 3 classrooms, and so we could absolutely do a little bit of work in trying to make some projections around it.
Tell me how it looked with Del Mar Heights, what you're able to project anything. I know you can't say like what the open rooms right now, but
what will that kind of add to the equation?
Well, Del Mar Heights will add 3 kindergartens with restrooms. We'll have some of those that are taken up obviously by Del Mar Heights students and staff. It'll add the 21 classrooms, but then we will also take some of the portables. We'll take all of the portables eventually off of Del Mar Hills. We'll do the modernization there. So there's sort of an ebb and flow to it because we are reducing some of the capacity that we currently have at Del Mar Hills to accommodate Del Mar Heights while opening Del Mar Heights. But there will be a net gain in number of classrooms by opening Del Mar Heights.
That'd be good to see, because, if you project out this with Del Mar Heights, add the classrooms, subtract the portables. I don't know about the portables at Ocean Air, if those are meant to go or not, but whatever the facilities plan says about those, just project it out to show what it'll look like. Rolling forward 1 year.
Just curious in terms of classrooms for kindergarten, how many do we have at Pacific Sky?
3. So then, really, again, the reason we are having the conversation tonight is that the question is this a new normal? It seems that we clearly are having a lower capture rate compared to births. If it bears out by the numbers that we're seeing now, we just calculated that 62% is far and away the lowest that we've seen in the years that I've looked at demographic forecasts. And I've been, a part of this for going on 10 years.